Welcome to The Kingdom Sleeps, the fantasy bedtime story from the world of Sopros, a vast and otherworldly landscape formed over the back of a sleeping giant. If you're new here and you'd like to know more about the lore of this series, you can go back and listen to our short guide in episode 0. For our returning listeners, tonight's story is something a little different to our usual actual play that we're just trying out before the return of Yom and Tonto for the series proper. We'll be hearing an account of the adventures of Professor Eli Shinrick and his mysterious encounter with the elusive black matter. If you enjoy tonight's episode, please remember to come back and comment to let us know, so that we can think about making a few more occasional episodes like this in the future. But now, relax, make yourselves comfortable, and join us where the kingdom sleeps. Well, where should I start? My name is Professor Eli Shinrick, and I have been a scholar of Mamu taxonomy and tribal history at the Royal Academy of Sun Cult for over 30 seasons. I have been gifted this peculiar modern Brightstone device by a trusted friend and skilled non-affiliated constructor, who assures me, presuming I have correctly attuned it, will, at this very moment, be creating an imprinted record of my speech. Though, quite honestly, I'm not entirely sure by what method the speech can be retrieved. Nevertheless, given the insecurity of maintaining written glyph records, and due to the sensitive nature of what I am about to relay, I thought this perhaps the best way of creating a confidential account of my misadventures over the past few days. And so, beginning at the beginning, it was barely 4 days ago that I first came to hear of the occult substance I have now taken to referring to as black matter. And though I had not known it at the time, that strange and terrible substance would soon drag me far from the well-charted dunes of Schwertsuna and deep into the belly of its most forsaken desert. A recent solo expedition had led me to one of the many remote service villages strewn along the western coast. I'd arrived seeking a night's rest and a place to catalogue my fragile collection of ruined fragments I'd collected nearby, just north of the Dullstone silt reaches, when I came upon a family of performers camped beneath a cloth pavilion near the village edge. Though to look upon them, one would not have suspected their creative occupation. Indeed, they were not performing that night. No music nor acrobatics. There was a quiet, serene, and somewhat comforting air to their settlement. The children played quietly at wagers with their polished stones, and the adults worked solemnly at preparations for their evening meal. What little light they'd kindled was sparse and subdued. It was this, in truth, that drew me, caring little for overtly vibrant displays in my day-to-day activity. Rila, the mother of the troop and clearly its matriarch, welcomed me with somewhat wary hospitality as I approached at first. After brief introductions and the polite exchange of travel-worn supplies, inquiring as to my plans, she eventually warmly invited me to spend the night at their encampment. We shared a hearty meal of maphile breast, which I was surprised to see outside of Sun Cult, let alone in such a remote region as this. And afterwards, they offered a digestif of a particularly strong mulled cactus mead of their own distillation as we sat and warmed ourselves by the dwindling fire. We spent some time exchanging stories of life and land, and I found them all to be quite pleasant company for guild folk, especially humble considering their artisanal lifestyle. It was just when I began to interrogate them on their activities of the last few days that the conversation became suddenly stagnant and guarded. After several glances and murmured words were exchanged between the adults, and the children were sent away to sleep in the caravan, Wheeler stared at me with grief-stricken eyes, and a pregnant silence filled the air. It was then that she decided to share their story. They had departed from Gertruska several days prior, after extended employment as entertainers at the festival of the reigning castle. Finding the marks quite plentiful, and their welcome not yet worn, they stayed on at the festival for several days longer than intended. Whilst this was a very profitable decision for the family, it meant a huge delay of perhaps a day before arriving at their next engagement to the west. This urgency of time, combined with a quite justified worry that they may encounter an impromptu taxation by the patrolling Guardians Guild on the eastern trails, they began to consider potential alternatives to their prescribed route. And, with careful deliberation, and the typical fool's confidence of those with more wheels than sense, they had decided to cut directly across the dead lands to the west. Just a few days, Wheeler had said, as if saying it quickly might make it true. For those of you who may be listening that are perhaps sheltered by a comfortable modern life of the city, unaware of what lies out across the breadth of the land upon which they live, the dead lands of Schwertsuna are no mere stretch of sand. They are a parched ocean of dullstone, littered with the crumbling remains of ancient battlefields and dormant cataclysms, a place whose expansive area and ever-shifting ethereal landscape makes maps a near impossibility, and navigation a skill reserved for only the most experienced and daring desert guides. Still, the family had prepared themselves, or so they thought, having acquired many days' resources in preparation for their long departure from civilization. They set out into the latent unknown. She claimed their initial passage through this lifeless landscape, though rather eerie and unsettling for the children, was relatively uneventful up until the second night. Having passed through a nicely flat, sun-blasted gorge with high rock walls that curled protectively overhead and very little invasive vegetation, they decided to set up camp in the shelter of this natural ravine. That night, quite restless from the long and confined journey in the caravan, the children wandered to play, as children do, following their petulant trail of imagination just beyond their mother's scolding voice. It was not very long after that Wheeler, midway through preparations for their evening meal, heard their desperate cries echo across the ravine. At first, Wheeler believed they were merely frightened by some desert creature, perhaps a dagger or overlarge thorn beast. But as she hastened forward towards the source of their shouting, turning the bend in the rocks, she saw something that, even in her retelling, made her hands tremble. A thick, black fluid pond-sized and shimmering with unnatural iridescence, pooled in a basin with its surface undulating with a lifelike uncanniness. 2 long black tendrils stretched out from the substance and coiled around the waists of her children. It is plain to understand that this was no simple oil deposit or natural bog well. She described it as a mass alive with movement, arms of glistening blackness, writhing and thrashing about a central mass, curling around the children and attempting to pull them into its depths against the frantic, struggling feet of these poor young victims. And worse, she said that it spoke. She had heard them, the children, crying, not just for her, but for someone. There's a person in there, Mother. We heard them, they're trapped. She remembered them screaming. When I next morning interviewed the children myself on the events, each spoke of a clear, almost musical voice calling out from beneath the surface. "Help me, please. I'm still here," is what it said. They'd followed the sound, they said, out of curiosity and concern. There is an old phrase shared among the nomads of Shuatsuna. Panic is a friend to the desert. And in this very case, it clung to the mother with particular cruelty. Rila admitted that she was completely frozen with fear and expressed much guilt for her momentary inaction. All she could do upon finding the scene was to watch in terror. But then, as she tells it, from the darkness around them came light. She described the sudden arrival of hundreds, she claimed without hyperbole, perhaps thousands, of Mamu spirits, darting and glowing in all their colors, coming together of a sudden and forming a great coalescence of pale white light. This spectral creature, shaped vaguely like a bird, descended upon the black matter. A silent confrontation unfolded, one her eyes and mind were scarcely able to understand, until, in what felt like at once a moment and eternity for her, the light overcame the darkness, and the blackness ruptured. It exploded into a rain of spectral color that descended to the ground as silent as snowfall, and was vanished, leaving nothing but a chalky mist in the air. The children were afterwards much shaken, their skin bruised and oddly tingling with what later looked like minor burns. However, within a few days, they had recovered entirely. No lasting damage or infection seemed to be present, merely left with the psychological scars that I am sure will take far longer to heal. Thankfully, the rest of their passage was safe and unimpeded, a fact for which I throw gratitude at the great perceiver, for meaning I was able to serendipitously meet with this family and learn of their curious encounter. Even whilst I was in the middle of listening to this incredible account, it became immediately clear to me that I must make swift and discreet plans to head towards the Deadlands myself and attempt to witness this black matter in person. Even perhaps acquire a sample if it were possible. Firstly, secrecy was imperative. I had and still have great fear of what might happen if such a thing were discovered by those of the council or guilds with more ambition than wisdom. So I urged Rila and her family to keep silent about the matter furthermore. She agreed, with what almost seemed like relief. Some times in our lives, I suppose, are easier forgotten than others. With haste, I made my way to the outskirts of Suncult, where a trusted friend of mine operates as a fixer for all manner of expeditions. He was unable to assist directly. His best and most trusted guide had ventured out days prior with a group of miners from the Harvesters Guild and had not yet returned. However, he pointed me in the direction of a young monstrum woman by the name of Ulrika. Now, if I am to be quite honest with the listener, Ulrika was not what I had in mind as a guide for this particular journey. I required someone of a direct and grounded nature, whom I could feel, frankly, had my interests and the interests of the expedition at heart. However, dressed in ragged layers that seemed more scavenged than selected, matted hair and unsanitary smell, with a particularly repulsive habit of constantly chewing and spitting sootweed, she offered very few words in general, and even fewer reassurances. I tried to explain the nature of my inquiry, subtle and cautious, of course, requiring more than just brute endurance, you see, but she only nodded, muttered a price that seemed offensively low, and began packing her things. With few other options and time against me, we left within the hour. The first day's ride across the eastern edge was, all things considered, quite pleasant. The heat was dry, the houndbacks agreeable, and the route surprisingly uneventful. Ulrika kept to herself, answering my questions with mostly clipped phrases or pure silence. That night, after making camp, she suddenly vanished for a short while, making me believe she had perhaps duped me in order to leave with her meager half-pay. I was quite surprised when she returned with several plump gourd flowers, which she cooked into a surprisingly hearty stew over the fire. I offered polite conversation over supper, but she retreated quickly after to her bedroll with characteristic silence. I did wonder if I offended her perhaps, or maybe she simply disliked scholars. But I digress. By the next morning, I had resigned myself to her reticence. We made swift progress after this, reaching the last village before the Deadlands by midday. There, we purchased 3 great skins of water, several sacks of dried roots, tough bread, and a host of powdered preserves. I questioned the quantity. Our goal, I thought, was 2 days' journey in and 2 days out at most. But she merely looked at me with a furrowed brow and said, "The Deadlands are no straight line." And quite frankly, these words sent a chill down my spine. It was the first time I'd realized what kind of journey we were truly in for. It was that second night, setting up camp just upon the cusp of the Deadlands, that the pink Mamu came. I had just extinguished the fire after sitting alone for some time when I noticed their soft light playing across the nearby rocks. Pink and flickering like lantern flames underwater, a sight I am all too familiar with given my very many nights spent camping in the desert. Rising, I wandered over to observe them, as is my frequent custom. And this is when I noticed that these Mamu were of the turned and changed variety, characterized by the clouded darkness of their eyes and decidedly ungraceful, jagged movements. This was not my first encounter with the changed Mamu, and indeed these encounters were becoming more frequent, though I certainly have more tales of them from others than of my own. Nevertheless, seeming reasonably docile and unaware of my presence, I thought it a great opportunity to sit and take glyph of their behavior to add to my portfolio of research. Just as I stepped away to retrieve my writing materials, something must have changed. For as I turned back around, the Mamu had descended upon Ulrika's shelter and entered upon it. I quickly grabbed my bright stone staff. As I rushed to her aid, Ulrika sprang from her bedroll, her face lit with the eerie pink reflections. I attempted to shoo them away with the Brightstone, even speaking the sacred rites I had learned from Teldred's sanctum, but it seemed to have far less of an effect than usual, a fact I have acknowledged from past encounters. Ulrika, in vain, attempted to get away from the spirits, but they trailed her steps as she passed in and out of her tent, ceaseless and oddly attentive. Eventually realizing that they bore no violent intent, she ceased her protest, and with the weariness of the day behind her, I suppose she just lay down and drifted asleep beneath their strange, watchful vigil. By dawn, they remained, and Ulrika, though pale and withdrawn, offered no sign of surprise at their presence. If anything, she seemed now more softened. You could say diminished, perhaps. She spoke little, and not even in her usual gruff economy of language, but in barely audible grunts now. There was no breakfast taken either, though I offered twice. She only stared into the haze ahead, where the sands peeled open into the true Deadlands. We crossed into it around mid-morning. I cannot overstate the silence. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a deeper stillness, a shroud of untime. The heat was punishing, and the terrain a chaos of salt-cracked bones and sunken trenches. At one time, we passed a great war engine, half sunk in the sand, like the spine of some extinct gargantuan animal. Its hull was seared black, and what appeared to be claw marks scorched across the bronze faceplates. Completely fascinating. Also once, we glimpsed petrified trees growing upside down from a hillock, roots thrust skyward like begging hands. I thoroughly wished to stop and sketch and make glyphs of these sights, but Ulrika pressed on, mechanically almost, like she were possessed by some unseen compulsion. Looking back, this should have been my first sign of her descent, but at the time, I did not question it. The Mamu spiraled ever tighter at her waist, like pink smoke in orbit. Her face was clenched. She would not look back. Night arrived, and despite tireless searching, there had been no sign of the black matter. The stars that night were crisp and bitter. The land was once again far too still to feel at all a part of the wider world. At last, I had persuaded Ulrika, though it felt more like wresting breath from stone, to make camp beneath a natural sand arch, its belly hollowed out like a cave. She agreed with a narrow stare and the bitter silence of resignation. I built a fire and set down my thoughts, but she paced outside the ring of light, agitated and seemingly half feral. I thought best at the time, for some reason, to leave her well alone. Then, as the night deepened, Ulrika vanished into the dark, the Mamu following her ever closely, appearing almost as one with her now. I let some minutes pass, perhaps too many, before concern overtook me. I pulled a torch from the fire and stepped into the blackness. I found her some way down a slope of sand, standing barefoot in the moonlight, utterly still. I called out to her, but with no response, and as I moved closer, with the light of the fire revealing her desaturated features, her eyes, those stern, pragmatic eyes, had turned clouded and black, just like that of the Mamu. Even worse still, the Mamu had now shifted. No longer pink, they had turned a deep, iridescent black. As I approached, they began to coil and churn, merging into a single form, a mass of writhing shadow that wrapped itself around her like a cloak of flesh. This was it, the black matter. She spoke then, in a voice that seemed to come from outside of her. "Stay back," she said. "You cannot help. Only I can help." The words seemed nonsense, dream-warped, and yet were unmistakably hers. Fear wrestled instinct at this moment, but I am above all a scholar, and this was the moment I had risked all to present myself with. I leapt forward with one of the vials I had prepared, plunging it into a trail edge of the substance. It recoiled slightly, but I corked the sample. Then it struck me. A tendril whipped around my ankle, cold and burning all at once, just as the children had described it. Suddenly, a whisper began to ricochet around the inside of my ears. A voice I did not know, from a place I could not name, said to me, "We did not mean to hurt the children. It was not our fault." I cried out, nearly dropping the torch, but in that motion, something vital occurred. The fire's heat brushed the matter's skin, as it were, and it hissed, it quailed. Blame, I realized in this chaotic instant, was its undoing. I pressed the torch against its curling limbs, and it slithered back, reluctant, seeping away from Ulrika's frame. Slowly, it peeled from her, shivering like smoke in reverse, before sinking into the sand with a final groan of retreat. I jammed the torch into the earth where it vanished, in hopes it may act at least as some sort of temporary ward. Ulrika collapsed to the ground sharply then. She was unconscious, her body slack and strange in my arms. There was no time. I do not recall packing the camp, nor lifting her into the sled. I remember only the hiss of the wind and the stars shifting above me, and the sense, absurd yet certain, that some other presence guided me back towards the eastern trail, for it is indeed inexplicable how I could have managed to do so entirely by myself. I made it to Sunalaga by sheer miracle. A kindly local healer tended to the wound on my leg, which had turned out to an angry red colour, laced with creeping black veins. They treated it with a chilled fever balm, which seemed to heal it remarkably well, though I will likely bear a mark there for life. Ulrika recovered more quickly, though changed. She is quiet still now, not aloof as before, but somehow gentler, even bashful, I might say. We said very little before parting ways. She hadn't mentioned what happened, nor have I pressed her. I can't say why, but I trust her quite completely to keep the entire experience to herself. We both now carry something of that night inside of us that will remain. Now I sit at my desk in Suncult, looking at the vial that rests upon the table, still sealed, still pulsing faintly in the dark. I will begin tests tomorrow. The matter is inert, so far, but I cannot deny the sensation in my chest when I near it, as though I'm pressing too hard upon a wound that still tries to heal. There is much knowledge to be gained in this discovery, but also something deeper, which I cannot entirely place, and makes me extremely cautious. The one thing that still lingers with me is that this strange substance seems to have a memory. It spoke to me, and it remembered those children. And I just cannot help but wonder, as I look down at the minutely tremulous vial of blackness in front of me now. Will it remember me? Lelatu gestuga sum. Message end.